3 months ago, I was sitting across from a man who manages more money than most countries produce in a year. We were not in a television studio. There were no cameras. There were no reporters. There was no audience. It was one of those conversations that happens behind closed doors where people stop speaking in headlines and start speaking honestly. At one point I asked him a simple question. I asked him what keeps him awake at night. I expected him to mention inflation. I expected him to mention interest rates, geopolitics, or government debt. Instead, he looked at me for a few seconds and said something I have not been able to forget since. He said, "The thing that worries me most is not what people know. It is what people do not know." Then he leaned forward and added something else. He said, "The average person still thinks the financial world operates according to rules that quietly stopped existing years ago." And that sentence has been sitting in my mind ever since, because the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was right. For decades, ordinary people were taught a formula: work hard, save consistently, put money into traditional investments, be patient. Eventually you would build security. It was not a perfect formula, but it worked well enough that millions of families built their lives around it. The problem is that formulas only work when the conditions that created them continue to exist, and today many of those conditions no longer exist. Yet most people continue making decisions as if nothing has changed. They continue following a map that was designed for a world that is disappearing. And the reason I am recording this message is because I believe the cost of not understanding that reality becoming larger every single day. I want you to think about something for a moment. Think about the last time you received a raise. Maybe it was a few months ago. Maybe it was last year. Maybe you worked harder than ever and finally got rewarded for it. Now ask yourself a simple question. Did that raise actually make you feel richer? Or did it simply make you feel less squeezed? For millions of people, the answer is obvious. Their income is higher than it has ever been. Yet somehow they feel less secure than they did years ago. They are earning more dollars while feeling poorer at the same time. That contradiction is one of the most important financial signals of our era, and very few people are explaining what it means. The truth is that most people measure wealth incorrectly. They measure it by the number of dollars they possess. But wealth is not dollars. Wealth is purchasing power. Wealth is what those dollars can actually buy. And once you understand that distinction, a lot of things that previously seemed confusing suddenly make sense. You begin to understand why someone can earn twice as much as they did 10 years ago and still feel financially trapped. You begin to understand why savings accounts that appear to be growing can actually be losing value. Most importantly, you begin to understand why some people are becoming dramatically wealthier, while others feel as though they are running harder just to stay in the same place. Now I want to tell you something that may sound uncomfortable. The largest financial institutions in the world do not behave the way they tell ordinary people to behave. Watch what they do, not what they say. Publicly they talk about confidence, stability, and long-term optimism. Privately they are positioning themselves for a world that looks very different from the one being described on television. They are increasing exposure to hard assets. They are diversifying internationally. They are reducing concentration risk. They are preparing for outcomes that most ordinary investors have not even considered. And whenever there is a gap between what powerful people say and what powerful people do, it is usually the actions that reveal the truth. This is not a conspiracy. It is not a secret meeting in a dark room. It is something much simpler. Human beings respond to incentives. Institutions respond to incentives. Governments respond to incentives. And when debt levels become large enough, when financial obligations become difficult enough, the incentives begin pointing in a direction that is uncomfortable to discuss publicly. Historically, societies facing excessive debt have rarely solved the problem through discipline alone. More often they solved it through some combination of inflation, currency depreciation, and financial repression. Those words may sound technical, but their consequences are not technical at all. They show up in grocery stores. They show up in rent payments. They show up in insurance premiums. They show up in every area of daily life. The average person experiences these changes as frustration. They walk into a supermarket and feel that something is wrong. They receive a bill and wonder why everything seems more expensive. They look at housing prices and ask themselves how anyone is supposed to get ahead. What they are experiencing is not random. It is not personal failure. It is the financial system sending a signal. The problem is that most people interpret the signal incorrectly. Instead of asking what the signal means, they blame themselves. They assume they are not working hard enough. They assume they are not saving enough. They assume they are somehow falling behind. In reality, many of them are responding rationally to a system that has changed in ways they do not fully understand. One of the biggest mistakes investors make is assuming that what worked during the last 40 years will automatically work during the next 10. History does not operate that way. Every major financial era eventually ends. Every cycle eventually changes. There was a time when bonds delivered extraordinary returns. There was a time when real estate seemed incapable of falling. There was a time when technology stocks appeared unstoppable. Investors who assume the future will perfectly resemble the past are usually the ones most surprised when reality changes direction. That is why the most important investment skill today is not predicting the future. It is adaptability. The people who survive periods of uncertainty are rarely the people who make perfect predictions. They are the people who recognize changing conditions early and adjust accordingly. They remain flexible. They remain diversified. They avoid becoming emotionally attached to old assumptions. Most importantly, they understand that protecting purchasing power can be just as important. Generating returns. If I had to summarize everything I have learned from decades of studying markets, economies, and human behavior, it would be this: financial success is not about finding a magic investment. It is about understanding the game you are actually playing. Most people think they are playing a game called earning money. In reality, they are playing a game called preserving and growing purchasing power. Those are not the same game. And once you understand the difference, your decisions begin to change. You stop chasing headlines. You stop reacting emotionally to every market movement. You begin focusing on assets, strategies, and opportunities that can survive multiple economic environments rather than only one. The next decade is likely to look very different from the decade behind us. That does not mean catastrophe. It does not mean collapse, but it does mean change. And history shows that periods of change create both risks and opportunities. The people who recognize the change early are usually the ones who benefit. The people who ignore it are usually the ones forced to react later when their options have become limited. That is why awareness matters. That is why understanding matters. And that is why conversations like this matter. The greatest financial advantage in the world is not money. It is knowledge applied before everyone else realizes what is happening. By the time something becomes obvious, most of the opportunity has already disappeared. The goal is not to panic. The goal is not to become fearful. The goal is simply to see reality clearly enough to make intelligent decisions while choices still exist, because the future does not belong to the people who know everything. It belongs to the people who are willing to adapt when the world changes around them. There is another conversation that almost nobody is having publicly, and yet it may be the most important conversation of all. It is the conversation about time. Most people think financial risk means losing money, but the greatest risk for many families is something far more subtle. It is losing time. It is spending 10 or 20 years following a strategy that no longer works and discovering the problem only after those years are gone. Money can sometimes be recovered. Time cannot. That is why understanding what is changing right now matters so much, because the cost of misunderstanding the environment is measured not only in dollars but in decades. Consider what has happened to the idea of retirement. For generations, retirement was presented as a destination. Work hard for 40 years, save consistently, and eventually your investments would generate enough income to support your lifestyle. The math behind that promise depended on a very specific environment. It depended on rising productivity, favorable demographics, manageable debt levels, and investment returns that consistently exceeded inflation. Today, many of those assumptions are being challenged simultaneously. Debt levels are higher, demographic trends are weaker, valuations in many financial assets remain elevated, yet millions of people continue planning as though the old assumptions remain intact. The result is a dangerous illusion. People see large account balances and assume they are secure, but a retirement account is not a number. It is future purchasing power. What matters is not how many dollars appear on a statement. What matters is what those dollars will buy 10, 20, or 30 years from now. If the cost of living rises faster than investment returns, the appearance of wealth can become very different from the reality of wealth. This is one of the reasons sophisticated investors spend so much time thinking about real returns rather than nominal returns. They understand that inflation is not merely an economic statistic. It is a force that quietly reshapes financial outcomes over long periods of time. What makes this moment particularly unusual is that multiple pressures are converging at once. Governments around the world face enormous debt obligations. Central banks are balancing growth concerns against inflation concerns. Consumers are dealing with higher costs. Businesses are adjusting to a more uncertain environment. None of these developments individually guarantee a crisis, but together they create a landscape that is far more complex than the one many investors became accustomed to during the previous decade. Whenever complexity increases, uncertainty increases, and whenever uncertainty increases, the value of diversification increases. That is one of the lessons history teaches repeatedly. The investors who survive turbulent periods are rarely the ones who place all their confidence in a single outcome. They are the ones who prepare for multiple possibilities. They recognize that the future is uncertain by definition. Instead of betting everything on one scenario, they build resilience into their portfolios and their lives. I remember speaking with a successful investor many years ago who told me something I never forgot. He said that the purpose of diversification is not to maximize returns during the best possible outcome. The purpose is to ensure survival across a wide range of outcomes. At the time, I thought it sounded overly cautious. As the years passed, I realized it was one of the wisest observations I had ever heard. Financial history is filled with examples of intelligent people who were directionally correct but still suffred because they were positioned too aggressively. Being right is not enough. You also have to survive long enough for being right to matter. That lesson becomes especially important during periods when confidence is high. Human beings naturally extrapolate recent experiences into the future. If stocks have risen for years, many assume they will continue rising. If housing prices have increased steadily, many assume they will continue increasing. If a currency has remained dominant for decades, many assume it will remain dominant forever. History suggests otherwise. Every trend eventually encounters limits. Every cycle eventually changes direction. The challenge is that these transitions often occur gradually at first, and then suddenly. Think about how major shifts happen in everyday life. A bridge does not collapse the moment a crack appears. A tree does not fall the moment decay begins. A business does not fail the day its problems start. The visible event is usually the final stage of a process that has been developing quietly for years. Financial systems are no different. The developments that dominate headlines are often the result of forces that have been building beneath the surface long before most people notice them. That is why paying attention to incentives is so important. Incentives often reveal more than statements. If policymakers face growing debt burdens, what options are available to them? If economies slow while obligations continue rising, how are those obligations likely to be managed? These questions are not political, they are practical. Understanding the incentives helps investors think more clearly about possible outcomes. It encourages preparation rather than prediction. One of the most overlooked realities in finance is that wealth tends to flow toward people who understand the rules of the game before those rules become obvious to everyone else. This has been true throughout history. During periods of technological change, wealth flowed toward those who understood new technologies early. During periods of globalization, wealth flowed toward those who recognized global opportunities. During periods of monetary change, wealth often flowed toward those who understood the implications before the broader public. The question, therefore, is not whether change is coming. Change is always coming. The question is whether you are preparing for it. Preparation does not require panic. It does not require extreme decisions. It requires awareness. It requires curiosity. It requires the willingness to challenge assumptions that may no longer be serving you. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that financial success is a process of continuous learning rather than a fixed destination. I often think about the difference between information and understanding. We live in a world overflowing with information. Every day brings new headlines, new forecasts, new opinions, and new predictions. Yet despite having access to more information than any generation in history, many people feel more confused than ever. The reason is simple. Information alone is not enough. Understanding comes from connecting information into a coherent picture. It comes from identifying patterns. It comes from distinguishing signals from noise. The signal I see today is not one specific economic indicator. It is the growing gap between financial reality and public perception. It is the gap between rising costs and stagnant purchasing power. It is the gap between expectations and outcomes. It is the gap between what many people believe the future will look like and what current trends suggest may actually occur. That gap is where both danger and opportunity reside. For some people, this realization will feel uncomfortable. It may challenge beliefs they have held for years. But discomfort is often the beginning of growth. Every major improvement in understanding begins with the recognition that something important has been overlooked. The goal is not to fear change. The goal is to understand it well enough to navigate it intelligently. Years from now, people will look back on this period and describe it as obvious. They will point to the data. They will point to the trends. They will point to the decisions being made by institutions and policymakers. They will wonder how anyone could have missed the signals. But that is always how history looks in retrospect. The future never feels obvious while it is unfolding. It feels uncertain. It feels confusing. It feels controversial. That is why paying attention today matters more than agreeing with a narrative tomorrow. The people who thrive during periods of transition are not necessarily the smartest. They are not necessarily the wealthiest. They are usually the most adaptable. They observe reality as it is rather than as they wish it to be. They remain flexible. They remain humble. And they understand that protecting their future requires responding to changing conditions rather than denying them. That is the real message. Not fear, not pessimism, awareness, because awareness creates options, and options create resilience. In a world where uncertainty is increasing, resilience may become one of the most valuable assets of all. The sooner people recognize that, the better prepared they will be for whatever comes next.